How have you been lately? We know life gets noisy, demanding, and sometimes a bit heavy. But tonight, take a moment to sit back, breathe, and listen. You don't need to believe in ghosts to appreciate this story. You just need to believe that not everything in this world wants to be understood. Some doors close for a reason. Some rooms stay untouched. Not because people forget them, but because they remember them too well. What you're about to hear isn't just another ghost story. It's the documented experience of a man who walked into one of the most haunted rooms in the world, armed with logic equipment and confidence. And yet something in that room stayed with him. Or maybe it took something from him that no one could give back. So tonight, let this be more than a story. Let it be a quiet reminder. Curiosity is brave, but it isn't always wise. Now turn down your lights, put on your headphones, and prepare to step inside. 50 Berkeley Square. London in late October carries a particular stillness that isn't just seasonal, it's historical, almost conscious. The fog lingers longer, clings harder to the brick, and settles deeper in the bones of the city's older quarters. Among the wealth and quiet luxury of Mayfair sits a townhouse that doesn't fit in, but refuses to be forgotten. 50. Berkeley Square is not broken, abandoned, or visibly cursed. It has been renovated, sold, painted over, and leased again, but something remains upstairs that no contract can remove. That second floor room, the one with the bell. No one ever talks about what it looks like inside anymore. They only talk about what it sounds like when it's too late. No one wants to admit that, in a city filled with history, some corners are haunted not by the dead but by what still waits. Michael Rowe was not a man of superstition. At 38, with over a decade in investigative journalism, he had spent more nights in reportedly haunted locations than he could remember. As a writer for a small but devoted paranormal publication, Michael specialized in confronting old legends, separating the theater from the threat, and boiling down ghost stories to what they really were: stress, trauma, architecture, and time. His approach was clinical, but not dismissive. He never insulted the places he visited and never mocked the dead. But he did not believe in hauntings. What he did believe in was the way fear made people remember differently, the way grief twisted events, the way houses reflected back the pain of those who lived in them. And yet 50 Berkeley Square always found a way to escape explanation. He had first read about the house in university in a footnote buried inside a book on Victorian hysteria. A young aristocrat had supposedly died of fright inside a locked room there in 1840. No marks, no struggle, just found dead, with eyes wide and hands clenched around a servant's bell rope. The record listed massive cardiac arrest, but the phrasing was strange, as if he saw something no living man should. Over the years, more stories surfaced. A sailor in 1879 who ran screaming into the street. A maid who leapt from the second floor window without a sound. A woman who entered to clean and left without memory of who she was. Michael couldn't find the original police reports, but he found something better: patterns. The incidents occurred in clusters, often 20 to 30 years apart, and always in autumn. Always alone. Always in that room. Arrangements were made through a preservation contact. The house was privately owned, maintained by a trust that rarely allowed overnight visits. But Michael's credentials, along with a signed liability waiver and a non-disclosure clause, opened the door. Literally, Elaine Weathers met him on the day he arrived. She was in her 70s, lean, deliberate, and not interested in conversation. She didn't explain. The house didn't offer opinions. She only led him silently up the main staircase, then stopped at the landing before a plain wooden door with a dulled brass knob. The hallway smelled faintly of smoke and polish, She pulled a small iron key from her coat pocket and handed it to him. Her hands were cold. "This is the only copy," she said, her voice firm but quiet. "You can leave at any time. But if you pull the bell," her eyes lingered on the red cord just visible under the door, "don't expect anyone to come." Michael offered a professional smile and nodded. She didn't return it. He turned the key and pushed the door open. The room greeted him like a held breath. It wasn't large. A single bed with an iron frame sat against the far wall. A desk and matching chair rested beneath a fogged window. There was a mirror, tall, cracked, leaning slightly away from the wall, and above the bed from the ceiling hung the bell. It wasn't ornate or ceremonial. It looked like a servant's bell attached to a crimson rope that disappeared upward into the ceiling. The kind of thing you'd find in a manor built before electricity. He stepped inside, setting his bag on the floor. The door clicked shut behind him. The air was cold, but not sharp. The temperature drop didn't feel unnatural, just neglected. He unpacked slowly. Digital recorder, notebook, temperature probe, EMF meter, 2, battery-powered cameras, and a thermal scanner. He walked the perimeter recording ambient noise levels. The floorboards were uneven but not rotten. The wallpaper was pale gold, curling at the corners like old leaves. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, as though it hadn't been cleaned in decades, but hadn't gathered anything either. He checked the mirror. It reflected normally. He noted that, at 7:13 p.m., he activated the recorder. Day 1 room is structurally intact. Bell mechanism appears original. Initial EMF levels, baseline. Will begin passive observation. He sat on the bed, noting the firmness of the mattress, the faint creak of the frame. The bell was directly above him, perfectly centered. He reached out and touched the rope. The fabric was dry but not brittle. It didn't move. He sat there for several minutes, listening to the silence of the room. Occasionally, he'd hear the faint groan of the house settling a draft, shifting beneath the door. But nothing else. No chills, no voices, no shadows. It was as he had expected, just a room. But that was the point, wasn't it? Ghost stories always started with nothing. TB, the first hour passed quietly as Michael took his time surveying the room with a careful eye and methodical rhythm that came from years of walking into supposedly haunted places and finding nothing but creaky floorboards and old plumbing. The gas lamp on the wall flickered in a tired amber hue, casting long, gentle shadows that moved with every shift of his weight. The equipment had all been placed exactly where it needed to be. Camera facing the mirror, another on the corner shelf. Thermal reader aimed at the bed, EMF meter resting near the desk, and his notebook ready beside it. All was silent. The type of silence that feels less like absence and more like anticipation. The kind of quiet that comes right before a sound you cannot name. At 8:47 p.m., the mirror began to fog, slowly starting from the edges and creeping inward. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, until the shape became deliberate, like a smear from a hand pressed against the other side. He walked to it, stared into the center, and saw nothing but the outline remained. And when he reached out to wipe it away, the glass cleared too quickly as if it had never been there. He returned to the desk, took notes, kept his breath even, but something in his chest shifted as if he had swallowed a tremor that refused to shake loose. By 10 to 12 p.m., the chair creaked beneath him, not from his weight, but as if someone else had just sat down in the empty seat behind him. He did not turn around. Instead, he held the recorder to his mouth and noted the sound as objectively as he could, though the edge in his voice betrayed his calm. Outside the window, the night hung like a heavy curtain. fog curling along the edge of the frame, like fingers waiting to tap the glass. At 11:04 p.m., he heard the knock once, faintly, then twice more steadily. It was not the sound of wood on wood, but something softer, like skin against old plaster. He stood and waited, pressed his ear to the door, but the hallway beyond was still. He returned to the bed and felt the air shift. The temperature dropped by 3 degrees in under 10 seconds, recorded on the meter, and confirmed by the way his breath suddenly bloomed into the darkened air. The mirror began to fog again. This time faster, the same spot reappeared a curved smudge of condensation that mimicked a palm pressed in panic or warning. He stared into it long enough to see it form letters 3 this time. Run. And as quickly as it appeared, it vanished again, without sound, without hesitation, without doubt. It was no longer about proof, it was about survival. He sat down not to rest, but to feel the floor beneath him, to remind himself of the rules of gravity and how they still applied. At 12:41 a.m., the bell twitched. Not enough to be wind, not enough to be accident. It moved like a thing being tested, pulled lightly by an unseen finger, and then let go. He stood beneath it, stared up at the frayed edge of the cord, red as blood soaked into cotton, and wondered how long it had been since anyone had dared to touch it. The EMF meter began to scream a long, slow buildup that ended in a click, and the lights went dim. His eyes adjusted quickly, but the corners of the room seemed to stretch further away, as if the walls themselves were breathing out time. He sat again, feeling every hair on his arms stand as whispers began from no single direction. They seeped in through the wood and the glass and the very air, not in words but in urges, in pressure, in rhythm. They said, "Pull over," and over again, gently at first, then with insistence like a memory you try to forget, but always find again when you are alone. At 1:32 a.m., the mirror cracked a thin spiderweb from corner to corner, and as he stared into it, he did not see himself. He saw the room empty with the bed untouched, the chair unoccupied, and the bell swinging wildly. He turned around expecting chaos, but found stillness. Only his own shaking shadow cast across the wall. He stood there until the whispers faded, or perhaps until they grew too quiet to hear, and he was no longer sure which was worse. At 2:15 a.m., the entire room seemed to breathe. The boards beneath the carpet flexed once then again, as though something massive had shifted its weight below the floorboards. Then all was still once more. He recorded the moment as calmly as he could, noting the time and the sensation, and yet he could not bring himself to replay the audio, not yet, not until morning. The bell moved again, this time more deliberately, swaying side to side like a pendulum without cause or anchor. He placed his hand on the cord, and it was warm. Warm, pulsing faintly as if something lived inside it. He backed away instinct louder than logic, reminding him that some thresholds are not meant to be crossed, not by skeptics, not by believers, not by anyone. At 3:04 a.m., the lamp extinguished without warning, the hiss of gas cut short by silence. The only light now came from the soft green glow of his monitor, still flickering, still alive. He crouched beside it, trying to find comfort in numbers and graphs, but even data loses meaning when the dark begins to speak. At 3:36 a.m., the bell rang a single sharp chime. Not loud, but absolute final, the kind of sound that tells you something has ended even if you don't know what. The EMF meter flatlined, then rebooted, then stopped entirely, as if whatever had passed through had drained it completely. Michael did not speak. He did not move. He simply sat on the bed with his eyes on the cord above him, waiting for it to fall or fray or wrap itself around his throat. But it did none of those things. It simply hung there, heavy with memory and warning. He did not sleep in any measurable way, only faded into hours of frozen silence, and opened his eyes again at 6:04 a.m. to find the room unchanged and entirely different. He slowly checked his footage and found most of it corrupted. Only fragments remained static, filled and jittery, as if the room had rejected being recorded altogether. The only clear file was a 3-second clip of him sitting motionless in the chair, whispering something over and over. But the audio was reversed, and the image mirrored. He could not bear to watch it again. That evening, he returned for the second night, because stories like these don't end on the first page, and some answers do not come to those who leave too early. He entered the room again, and the air met him like a breath exhaled too late. The walls were colder than before. The mirror had not cracked further, but it had not healed. The cord above the bed had twisted slightly now, as if someone had pulled it once in his absence and let go. He set up the cameras again, reconfigured the angles, checked the wiring twice, then sat in the same chair at the same desk and began again. The notes were briefer now, his hands less steady. He no longer tried to explain. He only tried to record. At 9:11 p.m., a sound came from the closet, a dragging scrape that lasted 6 seconds and then stopped without echo or source. He stood frozen, unsure whether to open the door or pretend it had not happened. He did neither. Instead, he wrote the time down and waited. At 9:38 p.m., the mirror blurred again, not with fog but with distortion, like someone was pushing on it from the other side, but the glass held its surface, shimmering just enough to suggest motion. At 10:06, the lamp flickered again, but this time the shadows it cast did not match the furniture. They bent too far, too sharp, and when he looked down at his own shadow, it stretched upward toward the ceiling instead of along the floor. At 10:47, a knock came from within the wall, not behind it but inside it, as though the wood had lungs and bones and wanted out. The bell above the bed moved again, and this time the whisper was not external. It came from behind his eyes, from inside his mind, a single command, pull like a thought, not his own. He stood beneath the cord again. The air around it shimmered faintly like heat on pavement, but the room remained cold. He did not pull, not yet. At 11:29 p.m., the recorder picked up a phrase he did not remember saying. A voice like his, but not his, repeating the words. It ends here over and over until it degraded into static. He played it back twice before deleting the file. Not because it scared him, but because he feared it would remember more than he did. At midnight exactly, the mirror shattered completely. The crack exploded in silence, sending spiderweb lines to every edge. The sound it made did not register on any recording device, but he heard it with his body, like thunder felt through the spine rather than the ears. And then the bell stopped moving for the first time in hours. It hung dead and still, as if waiting to be given a reason to return to life. He stood beneath it, the rope now fully uncoiled and dangling near his face. The whispering had returned to cacophony, now desperate, urgent, terrified. Pull it. They said, pull it, and it will end. He raised his hand, slowly, placed his fingers on the frayed edge of the cord, and for the first time it felt like something pulled back. The tension in the rope was no longer just weight. It was resistance. Something on the other side held it too. He hesitated, and for a moment all sound dropped out. The light seemed to pulse. The cracks in the mirror darkened, and the air vibrated like a string drawn too tight. He closed his eyes, gritted his teeth, and pulled. The ring that followed was deeper than the first, not louder, but heavier. It moved through him, not into his ears, but into his chest. It shook the floor and the walls and the ceiling, and something in the gas lamp exploded. casting the room into a sudden blackness that felt thicker than shadow. The whispering vanished immediately. The EMF meter died, and the cameras blinked out all at once, leaving only silence, complete and unforgiving. Silence. He opened his eyes again. Sometime later, no light, no sound, no motion, just stillness. Like the moment after a scream, before the echo begins. He sat on the bed with his hands in his lap, the bell above him, motionless, the mirror broken, the air unchanged, and something in his memory scratched and clawed, as if trying to remind him that something had just happened, something that mattered, something that ended. His heart did not slow down after the bell stopped. If anything, it beat harder, as though reacting to something his mind had yet to register. The silence that followed. The ringing was too complete, too intentional. It was not the quiet of peace or absence, but the void left behind when something exits a room with force. He stood still in the darkness, blinking rapidly, trying to reset his vision to adjust. But the dark did not let him. Instead, it held on like a weight over his eyes. The shadows refused to take shape. The corners of the room stretched. The air pressed inward like the room itself was inhaling, and Michael found himself unable to move. His legs were limp, his spine stiff, and his arms still hanging at his sides, like they had forgotten what they were for. From somewhere behind him, or maybe from inside his skull, came a sound like footsteps echoing through a flooded tunnel. Slow, dragging, deliberate, and impossibly deep. The kind of steps that sink into the ground and change the shape of a place forever. He wanted to turn but couldn't. The pressure in his chest was no longer fear. It was proximity, as if something enormous stood inches away, unseen but fully present, and it watched him not with eyes but with recognition. He knew now that it had always been there, not waiting to appear, but waiting for him to notice the room shifted again. Not physically, but sensorially. The air thickened with humidity, metallic and warm, and his thoughts started to unravel. Memory collided with memory, and he was no longer sure if he had ever left the room. If the first night had ended, or if it had just been a trick to lull him into staying. His name echoed once clearly spoken in his own voice, but with someone else's intention, and suddenly the walls pulsed outward like lungs exhaling for the first time in years. The mirror, despite being shattered, now held an image not reflected, but displayed, of Michael sitting exactly as he was now, but older, disheveled eyes hollow and mouth slightly open, as if he had been sitting there for decades. Behind that image were more images, hundreds, maybe thousands, overlapping slightly. Each of them, someone else sitting in the same pose in the same room, their faces frozen. Mid-thought, all of them locked beneath the glass, and the implication settled over him slowly. Not all who pulled the bell disappeared. Some remained, folded into the house like pages glued shut. Their last moments recorded not on tape, but in layers behind the mirror. Michael staggered backward, breath short and rapid. Reached for the desk blindly, and found it covered in a fine layer of ash that hadn't been there moments ago. The camera on the corner shelf blinked once, then died. The monitor flashed white and collapsed into black. He turned toward the door, his hand stretching out instinctively, but the knob had vanished. Not broken, not melted, simply no longer present. The wall was whole and smooth, and he realized with terrifying calm that the room had sealed itself. It had accepted him, or perhaps consumed him. And outside the foggy window, the square was still and dead. No wind, no people, just stone and cloud. And in that moment, Michael understood that the bell was never a warning. It was a trigger, and ringing it did not summon help or release it. Simply marked the transition from visitor to inhabitant, and now that he had pulled it, the house would not let him go. Not because it was cruel, but because it was complete, and Michael Rowe was the last piece it needed to remember itself. Fully. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the metal frame colder than it should have been. The whispering returned softer now, not pleading but familiar, like lullabies hummed in reverse, and in the gasping final seconds before the silence claimed him entirely, he began to repeat a single sentence to no one or to the next one who would come. "If you ring this bell, you're already dead." Elaine returned to the second floor just before noon, with the same key she had handed to Michael 2 nights earlier, though she already knew what she would find, or rather, what she wouldn't. She paused outside the door, listening not for noise but for absence, and she heard it clearly. A kind of emptiness that only came after something had left or been taken or changed. She turned the key slowly and pushed open the door. The hinges groaned slightly, but the room remained still. The mirror was cracked in every direction. The desk chair pushed back the bed untouched, neat as if no one had ever slept in it, and on the center of the desk rested a single audio recorder, its small light blinking a slow red pulse, the only sign that something in the room still remembered movement. She didn't step inside, she didn't speak. Instead, she closed the door again with deliberate care, locked it, and slid the iron key back into her coat pocket. She would mail the recorder as instructed, not to family. There was no family, not to authorities. There would be no report but to the publisher listed in the notes Michael had provided before arrival. The file arrived at the office of the Journal exactly 7 days later, postmarked from an anonymous box with no return address. The editorial team loaded the contents and found nearly 11 hours of continuous ambient sound, much of it unusable, but near the end at precisely 8 hours, 34 minutes and 19 seconds. A voice appeared, fragmented, layered, and filled with static. The transcription team slowed it down, filtered the noise, and revealed the final sentence spoken with clear fear and resignation. "If you ring this bell, you're already dead." The file ends mid-word, the final syllable clipped off as if interrupted or cut or consumed. The publication never released the recording officially. Instead, it was passed privately among staff, archived in a cold folder with no label, and quietly removed from the index. Weeks later, the editor-in-chief who had listened to the full file resigned abruptly, citing health and stress, and disappeared from public view. The recorder was never recovered. The townhouse at 50 Berkeley Square was once again shuttered for repairs and quietly delisted from all rental networks. The trust that maintained the property closed correspondence for the remainder of the year, citing structural concerns and plumbing issues. But no one on the block believed that they had ever intended to open it again. The window on the second floor remained shuttered always, even on warm summer days. And no matter how often it was cleaned, the interior glass showed a faint film, as though breath still lingered there. At night, passers-by sometimes reported a light behind the curtain, a flicker no brighter than a candle, and sometimes in the deepest hours of morning, a sound would echo down the square, faint and metallic, unmistakable to those who knew the stories. A single ring of a small bell, always. Once, never twice, the kind of sound you don't talk about. Not because you're afraid, but because you aren't sure if speaking it will bring it closer. And so the square stays quiet, the locals polite, the house untouched. Some places in the world are shaped not just by the people who live in them, but by what they remember. And the house at 50, Berkeley Square, remembers everything. It has no need to prove itself, no urgency to perform. It only waits for those who think they are stronger than silence or smarter than fear. And when they come, it does not warn, it does not threaten it. Simply watches and listens and waits. And when the rope is pulled and the bell rings again, the house breathes in and learns another name,